Hello and welcome everybody to today's webinar on speed management through vehicle technology. My name's Ross Morlock. I'm a director here at Brake, the road safety charity, and lead Brake's global fleet team, where we work with fleet operators and suppliers to share resources and best practice across the industry. Before we go any further today, I'd like to say a massive thank you to Telogis, who have sponsored today's webinar, and without whose funding we wouldn't be able to deliver this session for you. You should all now be able to see my presentation on screen and hear the audio alongside it. As attendees, you're all muted, so you don't need to worry about any background noise from your offices. We've got a fantastic speaker lineup for you today with 5 guest speakers. We're joined by Richard Cuerden, Director at TRL, David Ward, Secretary General at Global Encap, Jane Lupson, Senior Bus Safety Development Manager at Transport for London, Sean Clifton, Senior Manager National Fleets at ASDA, and David Lawrence, OEM Marketing Manager at Telogis. Some of today's presentations are pre-recorded, but I'm delighted that all of our speakers are joining us live today to answer any questions you may have. There are 2 ways for you to put forward your questions to us. Firstly, there is a chat box on the webinar panel where you can send your questions at any point during the webinar. Alternatively, there is a raise hand icon on the same panel. You can press this during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentations, and we'll unmute you and you can put your question to the panel then directly over the phone. Before we start with our first presentation, I just want to take the opportunity to give you a very brief overview of Brake, who we are and what we do. So Brake is a national road safety charity. We were set up and founded in 1995, and we exist to stop the needless deaths and serious injuries that happen on roads every day. We want to make streets and communities safer for everyone and care for families bereaved and injured in road crashes. Our vision is quite simple. We want a world that has 0 road deaths and injuries, and a world where people can get around in ways that are safe, sustainable, healthy, and fair. We promote road safety awareness, safe and sustainable road use, and effective road safety policies through campaigns, community education, information and advice for organisations operating fleets of vehicles, and road safety professionals. And of course, by running the UK's flagship road safety event, Road Safety Week, which takes place in November every year. We also provide essential support to people across the UK who have been devastated by road death and serious injury to help them in their darkest hours. In terms of that support, we run a quality accredited free phone helpline in the UK for people bereaved and seriously injured in road crashes. You can see some information on your screen now about the level of support that we gave in 2017. In addition to our helpline, we also provide support literature and work very closely with the police forces throughout the UK so that when someone does receive that knock on the door from a family liaison officer, they are providing them with best practice support literature and care. We campaign nationally and regionally to raise awareness amongst the public and to lobby government and push for change in road safety legislation. An example of this is our 2016 Roads to Justice campaign, which centred around getting justice for bereaved families. This UK campaign launched outside Parliament and gained a lot of media attention, and I'm sure most of you will have seen the changes to criminal driving sentencing announced in October 2017. We also do a lot of campaigning more generally on raising awareness of a range of topics, some of which you can see on your screen now. Awareness raising and education in communities is delivered through projects such as our Beep Beep Days. Each year, Brake helps hundreds of companies run road safety projects in their communities and inspire children to be safe on our roads. We have well-established events and resources to help you run activities locally to your business. Our community engagement team can help put you in touch with local schools and nurseries and give you advice on how to talk to different age groups. Or your company can work with Brake to establish your very own community project. We have two main projects this year, our Beep Beep Days for 2 to 7-year-olds and Brake's Kids Walk for 4 to 11-year-olds. Details are on your screen now, or please contact us for more information or to find out more. We also share training tools and guidance on global fleet safety best practice through our Brake Professional membership service. We provide our members with tools to manage occupational road risk, regardless of budget, fleet size, or vehicle type. We run an annual calendar of events, including webinars such as today's, and seminars and trainings throughout the year. And we also have annual flagship events, such as our Fleet Safety Conference and our Fleet Safety Awards. In addition to these events, we also produce a lot of resources for employers, including guidance reports on introducing policies and sharing best practice case studies. Alongside that, we provide employees with tools to use directly with their drivers. And you can see on screen now some of the posters, infographics, and videos that you can use to engage your own drivers. If you have any questions or would like to find out how you can get more involved with us here at Brake, please let us know. So, on to today's webinar. The presentations today will last for approximately 45 minutes. And as I referred to earlier, there'll be plenty of time to ask questions at the end, should you have them. Without further ado, we'll start with the first of our presentations today. So I'll hand you over to Richard Cuerden, Director at TRL, who's going to talk to us about the science of speed. If you bear with us, we'll just share Richard's presentation with you now.
Ross, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Richard.
Can you see my screen?
Yeah, we can see your screen.
Even better. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm so relieved that that worked. My name is Richard Cuerden. I'm a director at TRL, the UK's Transport Research Laboratory, and I'm also very proud to be a trustee of Brake. So it's a pleasure to be asked to speak this afternoon. And I thought I would just frame the conversation in a way of just reminding a lot of us really about why speed matters. And there's no getting away from it. There's a stack of literature that says for any given road, the quicker we travel on that road, the greater the risk that we're going to have collisions on it. And we can put all sorts of measures in place to reduce that risk, but essentially speed is one of the factors that we know that for like increases the risk of crashes happening. And one of the ways, of course, we avoid the crash is that we brake, we avoid the collision in some way. And what I enjoyed doing last year with the Brake comms team was that they challenged me a little bit to try and explain the mechanics of emergency braking. And so we started to think about, well, what is it that a driver does or a rider does in the stopping distance? How do we go from there being something to the vehicle coming to a stop or reducing speed? And we divide that into two really simple elements, the thinking distance and the braking distance. So the distance the vehicle will travel while you're thinking what to do, and the distance the vehicle will travel while you're applying the brake pressure to the brake pedal. And the thinking distance is fairly straightforward, and it's pretty natural to us all. We drive vehicles, we ride vehicles, we perceive the hazard, we recognize we need to do something, we decide we better do something, and we steer or we apply the brakes. But what's interesting is that the time that the UK Highway Code assumes you will do all that in is around 2/3 of a second. And so that means the Highway Code is pretty much thinking that we're all, in my words here, sort of Formula One style drivers, and we've got full attention all of the time, and the best reactions that are available to us. In reality, when you look at the literature and the real world data, and when we measure what people do, there's a real range, but the average of an attentive driver is something like 1.5 seconds. So from somebody appearing to step out onto the road to actually sort of stepping out, you to perceive that hazard, to actually the moment you've got your foot on the brake pedal, is around 1.5 seconds for most of us. It's a little bit longer for some of us, and some of us are, of course, a bit quicker. And so what we did as a bit of a campaign last year was we wanted to say, well, what difference does that make? What difference does that increase in thinking time make to the standard stopping distances that we all learn parrot fashion to a degree when we prepare to take our driving test, or certainly I did. And what it means is at 30 miles an hour, for a standard car, you're going to stop in about 11 meters further than would be quoted in today's highway code. So it's a really important point that we could be underestimating the stopping distances of our vehicles, because we could be overestimating our ability to think and to react. And the clever people in the comms team generated this great graphic. So the blue cars represent the thinking time, and the red cars, sorry, the thinking distance in meters, and the red cars represent the braking distance. And the real point I wanted to make on this slide was moving now away from the thinking part of braking to the actual mechanics of braking. So when we apply full deceleration to the vehicle, we apply the maximum braking we can. And on a modern vehicle, perhaps the brake assist system on that vehicle is going to come in, it's going to help us, it's going to decelerate that vehicle without locking the wheels, bringing it to a halt as quickly as possible. What we see is that the thinking part is linear. So if we compared the speeds 30 and 60 miles per hour, it's the time, and so we just simply double the distance that you would travel to think if you were going between 30 and 60 miles an hour. But the braking part isn't linear. It's disproportional. It takes proportionally much further to stop a vehicle going at higher speed, because you've got the increased energy, than it would at 30 miles per hour. So only small increases in our traveling speed can lead in much larger distances in our stopping distance. So here's an example. If you could imagine a car traveling at 40 miles per hour in a 30 mile per hour zone, if a pedestrian was to step out, the driver begins to brake when the pedestrian is 17 meters in front of him. We're pretty confident that the car is going to hit that pedestrian traveling at 20 miles per hour. Whereas if the car was traveling at 30 miles an hour, in exactly the same circumstance, the pedestrian steps out 17 meters, that car is going to stop 3 meters before the pedestrian. So we're going to avoid the collision altogether. So the risk of injury and the chances of the collision are dramatically increased by that 10 mile an hour change in speed. Now, this is one of my favorite graphs. I love it, but it's a little bit complicated, so I'll try and explain. We're really interested in risk. And so we know that the quicker you're going, the more likely to have the collision, but also we know that the quicker the vehicle's traveling, whether you're in it or struck by it, the greater the risk that you're going to be seriously injured or killed. And what this graph shows is the distribution by risk of fatal, serious and slight casualties in the UK, of pedestrian casualties when struck by the front of a car. And so I can read across to the percentage of being killed. I know at 30 miles an hour, if a car strikes a pedestrian, 7% or 7 in 100 of those pedestrians are going to be killed at 30 miles an hour. But the point I want to make there is that the vast majority of people who are struck by cars are struck at speeds of 30 miles per hour or less. So when we're looking to protect pedestrians, we really need to be protecting them at speeds of 30 miles an hour, because that's where we're seeing most of our fatalities. As the speed increases, there are less pedestrians who are hit, but the risk of dying or sustaining serious injury really rapidly increases. And interestingly, it just seems to increase. Whichever data you look at, the German data, the UK data, there's all sorts of international data, the point of inflection, the point when you start to see a big change in the risk is around 30 miles per hour. So if I quantify that very quickly, for a pedestrian struck by the front of a car travelling at 30 miles an hour, we'd expect 7 in 100 of those pedestrians to die. If I was to draw some more lines on that chart, at 40 miles per hour, we shoot up to 31%, so 3 out of 10. But just by increasing the speed from 40 to 43, we go from a 31% chance of death to a 40% chance of death. So very small increases in speed as we go over 30 miles an hour result in really big changes in the chances of somebody dying, or the risk of somebody dying. And that isn't just the case for pedestrians, it's the same for lorry drivers, for car users, and we can plot the curves. And the chart on the screen now is for car drivers wearing seatbelts in frontal impacts. And you can see that for a change in velocity, this time it's around 40 miles per hour change in velocity of the vehicle, you start to see an inflection point when the risk really starts to get very high. And in way of perhaps just introducing what some of my sort of follow-on speakers are going to talk much more about, we know that speed causes these problems, and we know that people can have problems actually knowing what speed limit they should be adhering to, because sometimes it isn't always obvious. And also we can all inadvertently drift over a speed limit. So there's a lot of new technology on cars these days, from speed limiters, which you could set as a driver. So you could go into a 30 mile an hour zone and you could limit the speed of your vehicle through the car itself. Increasingly, we're seeing intelligent speed assistance technologies and automated emergency braking. So if I just talk about the intelligent speed assistance very, very briefly, what we think may happen this year is there's a reasonable chance that the European Parliament and Council could vote to mandate for intelligent speed assistance to be standard fit on all motor vehicles within 3 to 4 years from now, which would be fantastic news, because that would mean all new vehicles would be fitted with technologies, with cameras essentially, and with relatively intelligent satellite navigation systems. So as you or I were driving along, we've got a map-based system that's pretty accurate and tells us the speed on the road and encourages us as a driver to remain within that speed. But they've also got camera-based systems that are reading road signs, and are again informing. And the vehicles are able then to fuse that data and give us the best information as a driver to keep us within the speed limit, because of course you could have a temporary reduction in speed limit, and speed limits change. This video, I'm not sure is going to play, but we're going to give it a go. No, it's not, I'm afraid. So I'm hoping David, or one of my fellow speakers, is going to show a really good video of autonomous or automated emergency braking systems. The video, if it had played, would have shown a Volvo with a pedestrian AEBS system. And what the vehicle does is it's scanning the road ahead, looking for pedestrians or looking for other objects or vehicles as well. And if it sees one, and it's constantly calculating the distance and the likelihood of a collision with that object, if that becomes a likelihood, if that collision becomes likely and the driver is doing nothing about it, the system will take over from the driver, apply the brakes to either prevent the collision altogether, or if the collision does happen, to have mitigated the outcome, to have slowed the vehicle down. So my conclusions, hopefully to get us going for the rest of the afternoon, are that there's absolutely no doubt that for any particular road, the risk of collision increases as we increase speed. We know that the risk of road user injury increases at a non-linear rate, and for pedestrians that's around 30 miles an hour. Anything over 30 miles an hour, it starts to get high risk to the extreme for pedestrians and cyclists. And it's really important to remind ourselves the importance of thinking distance and attentiveness when we're driving, and just being aware of what is a suitable speed for any given road. And similarly with braking distances, relatively small increases, going over a speed limit by quite a small amount, can have quite a big difference on the amount of time and distance it's going to take to stop a vehicle. And finally, there's a lot of technology out there now that can help us. So we can be encouraging fleets to buy vehicles that come with standard fitment of speed limiters, intelligent speed assistance. Some of you will probably notice that I'm calling it intelligent speed assistance rather than intelligent speed adaptation or any of the other names that it can be given. I really favour intelligent speed assistance because it's a much more friendly term, it's a much more easier term for drivers and people to understand. And last but not least, we should really be pushing for all cars to be fitted with autonomous emergency braking technologies, because there's always going to be a time when either somebody pulls out in front of a vehicle, or when we're not being perfect, which of course as human beings none of us are, and so we didn't pay the sort of attention that we should have been on all occasions. And in those instances when a collision is inevitable and we as a human being aren't braking, the vehicle can take over and brake for us and hopefully avoid the collision and anyone being hurt. So that concludes my introduction. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. That was brilliant and really insightful. Thank you very much. We've had a number of people that have submitted comments or questions throughout. In particular, your slides, Richard, are in hot demand. What we will do following this webinar is we will share slides with everybody, and we will share a recording at a later date of the webinar as well, so you all will be able to access the slides and the recording should you want to share with other people. So thank you very much for those comments so far, and please do keep your questions coming in, and we will have that Q&A session at the end of all of the presentations. Okay, so I'd like to now move on to our second presenter, and I'd like to welcome David Ward from Global Encap. David, over to you.
Great, thanks. I don't know if my screen is on display now, but
it is. Yes, we can see it and we can hear you perfectly well, David. Thank you.
Well, the wonders of technology. Anyway, I'm going to give a perspective. It's a very global one because, as the name suggests, Global Encap works internationally. So our focus is not so much on the UK. We were set up in 2011. We're a UK registered charity, and we are a sort of platform of cooperation amongst the different NCAPs around the world, of which there are 9 different programs. The one that you've probably all heard of is Euro NCAP, which is 20 years old. And so our task really is to try and encourage cooperation between the different NCAPs. The first ever NCAP was set up in the US, and the essential idea behind NCAPs is to do independent crash testing above and beyond regulations to give consumers a good sense of what safety levels vehicles offer. And there are now programs in Japan, Australia, China, Latin America, Southeast Asia, and so on. And we work quite closely also with the UN around vehicle regulations. And in 2016, we were very pleased to receive the Prince Michael Premier Award. We're funded mainly by the FI Foundation, Bloomberg Philanthropies, so I need to give them a good plug. So that's who we are. We strongly support what's called the safe system approach to injury prevention, and that actually follows very well what Richard was talking about in relation to speed. There are many different diagrammatic treatments of the safe system approach, but this is one that recently was done by the World Resources Institute, and I think it's quite an attractive way of presenting the way to think about the safe systems, which apply as much. A safe system approach can be applied as much by a government when it's trying to formulate its road safety policies as an individual company within its own sort of micro space of a company. And starting on the left, you have a column of principles, and those principles are really very basic. That humans make mistakes. We all make mistakes. Even the best drivers make mistakes. It's a natural human phenomenon, and every day on roads all over the world, lots of mistakes are being made. And the basic point is you're not going to fix all of that. Humans are inevitably going to make mistakes. The point should be that making a mistake shouldn't be punished by death in a safe system. The second key principle is that humans are actually very vulnerable to injury. And in fact, the very helpful diagrams, graphs that Richard just showed illustrated that very well. We all know that kinetic energy, when released in a crash environment or a collision environment, the vulnerable human being completely unprotected really is it's very unlikely to survive uninjured, and very likely to be fatally injured, anything much above 30 miles an hour. The other principle, sort of organizational one, is that responsibility for making roads safe is not one person's problem. It's certainly not the victim's problem, and it's not exclusively a government problem. If you're going to make road safety work, or the safe system work, it has to be in a shared structure where the people responsible for managing the roads, the people using them, all have a shared set of responsibilities to make it work. Then another principle is, if you like, a kind of moral statement as well, is that we really shouldn't accept death. We shouldn't run our roads on the basis that there's an acceptable level of fatalities. In a lot of sectors, like the aviation industry, certainly couldn't work on that basis, and neither should we in the aspect of road transport. Finally, is that one of the underlying approaches to the safe system is always to be proactive rather than reactive, trying to anticipate problems rather than react to them. Then in the middle column, there are sort of what I would actually prefer to call methodologies. It's all about, for instance, collecting data, doing good economic analysis and setting priorities, sort of planning issues. And then the different stream on the final set of columns, are those things that can influence the outcomes. And a key point about the safe system approach is to identify all the different factors that can impact reducing the risk of injury. So key issues here are things like land use planning, the way in which roads are laid out, improved mobility options, that's giving a better choice of mobility options to try and reduce the most risky ones, good enforcement, the role of vehicle design, which is what we're talking about. And speed management is also here. And I think, in fact, if I was redesigning this chart, I would actually put speed management up there in lights, because the essence of the safe system approach is to recognize that speed is the ultimate determinant of whether or not injury and serious and fatal injury is going to occur. It's sort of very closely related, obviously, to the principle about the vulnerability of human beings. As Richard was saying earlier, in almost all road conditions, the higher the speed, the greater the risk. And another way of saying the same thing is that vehicles and road infrastructure all operate in a certain kind of safety envelope. And that is hopefully because the road has been designed with traffic calming or barriers and so on. The vehicle has got airbags, there are seat belts, all these other measures. They're all operating within a certain assumption of safety guaranteed up to a certain speed. But if you go outside that speed envelope, then basically the safety system is not going to work. And so I like to think of it, if you like, as a sort of loading requirement. Is we operate typically, for instance, in passenger cars, where provided the vehicle is, is a good 5-star car in Euro NCAP, that it's being driven appropriately to the rules of the road, and the driver's not drunk, etc., and the road infrastructure is pretty good, then basically any kind of crash up to around 50, 60 miles an hour should be survivable. But beyond that, no. And that's because the safety envelope has run out. So essentially, speed is always going to be the ultimate determinant of the safe system. So just to talk about our view about vehicles, and this is a very global perspective. Roughly every year now, the world is producing something like 70 million new cars. And unfortunately, globally, about 20% of those don't meet minimum UN or EU crash test standards. So they don't have airbags, they don't have anti-lock brakes, electronic stability control, and so on. They're like the vehicle pictured in the bottom one, the silver vehicle there that's completely collapsed. You can see the body shell didn't stand up, no airbag, no point in fitting an airbag. That vehicle is a 2016 model from India, where until last October there were no crash test standards. The car on the right, which is much better, It's a VW Up, is made in Brazil. It's a 5-star car, still a small, fairly affordable car, but you'll see the body shells worked fine, the airbags gone off correctly. And that's what we want, plus also the crash avoidance systems, in particular electronic stability control, which is now mandatory, has been mandatory in Europe for, well, since 2012. So that's the challenge we face, is how do we ensure that right across the world, all vehicles meet the kind of specification of the red car on the top. Interesting also to reflect that 20 years ago, when Euro NCAP got going, I could have shown you, could have included in this a picture of a smashed up car like the one, the silver one, and that would have been the Rover 100, which performed as badly as that. And now, of course, we don't see that because we've had the benefit of EU-wide crash test standards and Euro NCAP over the last 20 years. So that's our challenge sort of globally. We published a couple of years ago a report called Democratizing Car Safety, which recommends on a kind of roadmap the regulations that we think should be applied all around the world. Bottom line is, by 2020, we want all vehicles to meet basic crash test standards, have electronic stability control. We also highlight motorcycle anti-lock brakes as well. But you'll see at the bottom, autonomous emergency braking systems, which also Richard was highlighting there. They are the next generation crash avoidance system, and we're highly recommending them at this stage because so far they're not mandated anywhere, but that is about to change. Our work campaigning around democratizing car safety has been quite impactful. In 2016, the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution which basically endorsed what we're calling for, and a lot of our recommendations have been included in key policy reports and so on over the last few years. What's our agenda for 2030, the next decade going forward? What we want to see across the world is the full penetration of vehicles that meet the basic crash test standards, have ESC. Essentially, that's a catch-up for the rest of the world to where the UK, Europe, and other high-income countries already are. But the really exciting thing, which Richard was touching on, is what's coming next. And that is a further rollout of crash avoidance systems. And this is going to be done through, I think, a combination of incentives and regulatory action. Incentives, what I mean by that is there's the possibility that insurers, governments through the tax system, and even just by Euro NCAP and others giving points in star rating systems, giving an incentive to manufacturers to accelerate the use of these systems, and then also regulatory action, which I'll come on to in a minute. The most important by far are autonomous emergency braking, intelligent speed assistance, and motorcycle anti-lock brakes. Autonomous emergency braking, Richard highlighted, there are three main systems of AEB. There's a city system, which is relatively low speed, interurban, which is, as it suggests, is for out-of-town roads, and also a pedestrian system. Unfortunately, I don't have a film to show the pedestrian test, although I'm sure if you go to the Euro NCAP website, you'll be able to find them. But there are three AEB systems. They are now available on the market, but at present not mandated. But that is coming soon as a result of European legislation, which I'll come on to again. Intelligent speed assistance, which Richard also highlighted, very important system, which is through a combination of maps and cameras, will inform the driver of the speed. And then finally, motorcycle lock ABS, which has very good evidence to support it improves stability under braking of bikes. Now, what Global Encap is doing is encouraging fleet managers to choose five-star safety at all times, and to really try and encourage fitment of best available technologies wherever possible. We've got a current fleet purchase guide, which calls for 5 stars in whichever region. So obviously in Europe, we'd say any responsible fleet should only be buying 5-star Euro NCAP rated cars. Some companies are operating in markets where there simply aren't NCAPs available. In Africa, some parts of Southeast Asia, Indian subcontinent, for example, where there is no NCAP data, we suggest applying the minimum UN regulations, saying to any manufacturer that you're buying vehicles from to ask them to guarantee that the vehicles meet the specific regulations. And this set of guidelines we have issued to major global companies, and we update it periodically. It'll be updated again later this year. At the moment, you'll see that we highly recommend autonomous emergency braking. We're going to also add in intelligent speed assistance in the update coming later this year. Richard, we a certain amount of repetition here, but we completely agree also that ISA is an extremely important system. It can give the driver very good information around what the prevailing speed limit is. It will slow the vehicle, typically through deceleration rather than braking, to encourage the driver to remain within the speed limit. They are overridable, so the system, in some cases, you need to be able to accelerate out in certain circumstances, and it allows that. But we think it's an extremely important, valuable system. Euro NCAP has included forms of intelligent speed assistance since 2013, so it's in their rating system already. And there are several manufacturers that now have the system available. There's nothing that new about it, really. Research has shown that ISA could save up to 33% of road traffic injuries on urban roads. It also significantly has a fuel efficiency gain, obviously, as well, because tending to encourage lower speed driving is also going to improve fuel efficiency and reduce CO2 emissions. So there's a green aspect to all of this. Now, the interesting innovative thing that's happening this year, in fact, on May the 2nd, the European Commission, which is the executive arm of the EU, will be proposing a new raft of vehicle safety requirements under its revision of the so-called General Safety Regulation. That's going to include autonomous emergency braking, rolled out in over a number of years. And also, we expect ISA as well. It's going to be by far the most important set of changes to vehicle regulations since the late 1990s, when the European Union introduced crash test standards for the first time. So it's very widely anticipated. It is going to cause some interesting debate here, because of course we're in the process of leaving the EU, and there will be a question mark about whether the UK simply says these are very sensible ideas and we'll adopt them anyway. But that remains to be seen. Certainly Global Encap's view is, whatever one thinks about being in or out of the EU, the merits of these regulations are overwhelming, and the UK should certainly follow them. So that's what we hope will happen. The legislative process in Europe typically takes about a year to 18 months, and then there's usually some interval before they're introduced mandatory into new vehicles. So probably we're talking about a lead-in time of about three years or so for some new models. Endorsing all of this also is the World Health Organization. Last year they put together quite important package of policy measures for safety for countries around the world to consider, and it was quite significant that they included ISA as well. So you've got very powerful intergovernmental bodies, whether it's the European Commission or the WHO, all endorsing the system. So that's really what I was going to highlight. I'm very similar to Richard. I'm afraid there's a certain amount of repetition, but certainly from our perspective, there's nothing more important in the next stage in terms of speed, technologies that will affect speed, which is the combination of autonomous emergency braking and ISA. So thank you very much.
Thank you, David, for that. We have had a number of interesting questions come through as part of your presentation, which we will come back to at the end. So please do keep those questions coming through, and thank you, David, once again. Our next presentation is a pre-recorded slot from Jane Lupson at TfL. We will start this presentation playing now, but as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm delighted that Jane is joining us live today to answer any questions you might have specifically around her presentation. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Jane Lupson and I'm the Senior Bus Safety Development Manager at Transport for London. And my presentation is going to run through our trial of intelligent speed assistance in London. We launched the initial trial in June 2015, installing ISA on all buses serving 2 routes in London, the Route 19 and the Route 486. These routes were selected using customer service data and data analysis of routes that included low bus compliance with speed limits, the most 20-mile-per-hour streets, the least opportunities for cars to overtake buses, and the highest number of collisions with pedestrians and cyclists. Data was collected before the ISA device was switched on, indicating that higher speeds were mainly recorded on off-road sections, for example, between the bus garage and start and end of the route, and in 20-mile-an-hour speed limits. Speed compliance issues were most commonly found in the late evening, followed by the morning and then daytime. In this case, we classify higher speeds as those that are higher than the prevailing speed limit. The trial was possible thanks to London's digital speed limit map. The digital speed limit map shows all speeds for roads in London. As you can see from the slide, green indicates 20 mile an hour, blue 30 mile an hour, darker blue 40 mile an hour, purple 50 mile an hour, and burgundy 60 miles an hour. Our digital speed limit map helps development of the next generation of in-vehicle technologies and mobile phone apps. It also ensures existing services, such as sat-navs and GPS, provide the best information on the speed limit of London's roads. The ISA technology was supplied by Zeta Automotive, who adapted their product EconoSpeed into an ISA device. We also worked with the bus operator Go Ahead London on the 2 trial routes, who worked closely with Zeta and TfL to implement the trial. ISA was an intervening type which utilises GPS data matched against an onboard map and speed limit database to electronically prevent any equipped vehicle from exceeding the prevailing speed limit by controlling the amount of acceleration that was possible. The system was not able to apply the brakes, and nor did it prevent the bus driver from doing so at any time. The driver retained regular control of the accelerator up to the posted speed limits of the road on which they were travelling, after which point any demand for further acceleration was restricted. We did experience some fitment issues during the trial, which I'll go into a bit later on. The results of the trial were mainly positive, but with some issues for future consideration identified. We found that the effectiveness of ISA with regard to speed limit compliance of buses was successful in improving speed limit compliance. However, it was less effective on downhill sections. The behaviour of vehicles following the ISA-fitted bus showed no adverse effect, and that it can actually reduce speeds of surrounding traffic. The benefits and disbenefits of ISA for TfL and the bus operators were that marginal safety improvements were modelled, and there was no significant difference in fuel usage, but some evidence of improved emissions in some 20-mile-an-hour zones. However, we did see a marginal increase in journey times. Transport Research Laboratory monitored data sources and evaluated the trial for us, mainly by comparing pre-trial data to data collected during the trial. We also had 2CV, who are a marketing research company, conducting surveys with bus drivers and passengers in 2 waves to ascertain initial reactions, and then a second trial once the drivers are more accustomed to the technology. Driver attitudes to ISA improved throughout the trial, but there were some concerns that remained, particularly during off-peak shifts. The particular issues that drivers highlighted to us were that it was hard to overtake cyclists on hills within a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit, that other road users still go over the speed limit and lose their temperate bus drivers for staying within the limit. They said they found it harder to pull out into traffic that was speeding, and that some customers were asking why the bus was going so slowly and putting pressure on the driver. We found that customers were unaware that their bus was fitted with ISA, but supported when it was explained. Overall, customers think that ISA will mean a more comfortable journey, as it will prevent drivers from driving too fast and erratically, and create safer roads, particularly for pedestrians and cyclists. As a result, TfL plans to roll out ISA and develop a bus safety standard. The rollout of ISA began in December 2017 on new buses. This will equate to approximately 700 buses per year going forward. As an interim measure, a web-based interface is also being developed that will allow retrospective analysis of bus route speed compliance. Given the clear benefits to us all, TfL, operators, drivers, customers and other road users, of keeping within the speed limit, and given our knowledge of wider European legislation changes, our influence on the direction of change and on our own policy direction, the decision to roll out ISA onto the bus fleet was a fairly simple one. However, the trial did show us that, again, there were going to be issues with retrofitting the technology. In fact, it was very problematic, and retrofitting is not actually the best way to balance our desire for casualty savings against our responsibility as a public authority. So the best way forward is fitment at point of manufacture. Given our desire to achieve the best safety features we can for buses, most economically and in a controlled fashion, we have rolled ISA up into the bus safety standard work stream. This is a package of safety measures, both primary and secondary, that will include technologies such as autonomous emergency braking or other collision avoidance systems, front of bus and mirror design improvements, internal bus design improvements, and technology to prevent pedal confusion. Initially, ISA units will be fitted to buses, but once our iBus 2 system comes online, it will be integrated in the system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane. A really interesting case study there, an example of ISA technology being used and the benefits of it. Thank you for that. Right, we now turn our attention to a presentation from Sean Clifton at ASDA. Sean, are you on the line?
Yeah, good afternoon, Ross.
Perfect, thank you very much, Sean. I'll hand over to you now.
Okay, thank you. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to talk to your group. I hope I'm coming through loud and clear. Unfortunately, I've had some technical difficulties today accessing the webinar, so I hope you can bear with me as Ross and I navigate through what is a sum total of 4 slides and should take us no more than 6 or 7 minutes in total. So hopefully you're seeing the header slide. My name is Sean Clifton, and I'm the Senior Manager for ASDA's National Fleets. By way of a little background, ASDA's commercial fleet, so we're split into 2 key business units. There's ASDA Logistics Services, where we have 1,000 large goods vehicles, 3,000 trailers, a little over 2,500 drivers operating in 28 centres, and we cover some 78 million miles per year. The fleet collects and delivers retail goods on primary and secondary distribution routes throughout the UK. The second business unit is our online grocery fleet, where we have 2,000 light commercial vehicles, 6,000 drivers operating in just over 300 operating locations and covering 56 million miles a year. We deliver groceries to the homes of our online customers across the UK, and this is one of our fastest growing parts of our business, seeing growth in excess of 10% year on year. Now, both our fleets are fitted with camera systems. This is to help our drivers while out on the road. There's an Encap heads-up display giving improved visibility to the sides and rear of the vehicles, but also helps provide evidence for investigation into incidents as the footage is constantly recording to a hard drive. So these 2 fleets combined are a significant presence on the UK roads every day, and we do take our responsibilities for road safety very seriously. That said, the pressure of on-time deliveries, combined with traffic congestion, roadworks, road traffic collisions, all potentially causing delays, can have a potential knock-on effect to driving behaviour. and sometimes that behaviour could express itself in forms of speeding. So we are, as an organisation, interested in how to improve that position. So just sticking with a little bit of a bit about ASDA and what we currently do in relation to speed management. So clearly we have driver training. All reputable organisations will have that, and all our drivers are trained both on the road and in the classroom. And part of that is about the use of appropriate speed. All of our commercial vehicles have telematics installed, and it's quite a comprehensive system. It's not just for vehicle tracking or driver performance management, but it's also our customer order management system. So it's very comprehensive in that respect. We conduct regular driver license checks, typically every 3 or 6 months. And as I mentioned, the vehicle cameras that we have on our vehicles are used to support incident investigation where speed could be a contributory factor. And also clearly any speeding offences that are reported into ASDA are investigated, discussed with colleagues involved, and where appropriate, either training or potentially disciplinary action, or maybe both, would be the outcome of those investigations. However, today I've been asked to talk briefly about ASDA's use of vehicle-based speed technology. Just for the avoidance of doubt, I'm certainly not putting myself or ASDA forward as experts in this area. I think we've heard a couple of people already present who would be certainly far more qualified than I. However, as I said before, our commitment in this area remains very strong. So, yes, in ASDA, we, not surprisingly, have speed limiters on all of our vehicles. That includes the light commercial vehicles. These are used in part to maintain good fuel performance, but clearly also restricts the top end speed of the vehicle. Particularly on the light commercial vehicle, we do restrict that to 56, much to the annoyance of our drivers. However, we feel it's the right approach to maintain both fuel economy and a level of safety on the roads. Adoption of that speed limiter on the home delivery fleet was relatively easy for us. Given that we are final mile delivery for home shopping, we're based in the delivery area we serve, and we spend only a very small proportion of time on the fastest of roads. However, speed limiters are ironically limited in their ability to stop speeding on slower roads or travelling faster than the vehicle in front. We've already heard of a couple of systems that are out there and available that help in this area. But what we were, as an organisation, were early adopters of assisted braking technology on the large goods fleets. Ahead of this being mandatory, I believe this was back at the end of 2015. The pictures at the bottom of the slide, I hope you can see, were taken at Volvo in Sweden, where firsthand we saw the system being demonstrated using an 80-ton truck and trailer that was travelling much faster than the vehicle in front, and which stopped safely without any driver intervention whatsoever. And having sat in the cab and been subject to watching a driver not touching any controls whatsoever, that was quite an eye-opener. But equally, these systems still have their limitations in that they're used more for emergency intervention, than maintaining appropriate road speed. And like many large fleet operators, we're constantly reviewing the specification of our fleets. And there's a number of technologies that are currently in discussion. So adaptive or dynamic cruise control. So there's many different names for this. And I think both Ross and Richard and David have all mentioned intelligent speed assistance, which is a further evolution of this. But clearly this is something as a further driver aid to help maintain speed appropriate to the traffic conditions. These systems are very much more common on cars, less so on anything larger. But clearly that is starting to move on at pace now. So that's one area we're looking at. Another area we're working with some of the manufacturers on as well is braking functionality linked to parking sensors. Now, we started this discussion primarily for the home delivery fleet, where we were seeing a relatively high level of rear end shunts at low speeds in urban areas. So it's designed to effectively kick in the same way as the assisted braking technology does on the large vehicles, but linked to the parking sensors. So hopefully when our manufacturer partners are able to adapt the vehicles they provide to us, then we'll have ourselves an opportunity to reduce collisions at those low end speeds in urban areas. I've mentioned previously before about telematics in all our commercial vehicles. And one of the things that we're reviewing is an approach to contextual speeding. Again, the intelligent speed assistance is an area that could address this. However, with many of the telematic systems these days, we should already be able to understand where our drivers are speeding without being caught by the authorities. So we're currently reviewing how best to approach that particular aspect. Probably a much bigger subject than time today would allow is the evolution of autonomous vehicles. Clearly, there's a huge potential in improving road safety with the type of functionality offer, and how that might aid or indeed replace the tasks of our driver population. Just touching on two kind of areas that I'm talking to with both our internal stakeholders and Walmart in the States is platooning. So I'm sure most of you will recognize that's the linking of two or more trucks in convoy. In theory, they take up less space and therefore could be safer. And thinking about Richard's comments earlier around the thinking distance, effectively would reduce braking response times to zero with that type of technology. So I know opinion is divided on this type of system on the UK roads and whether there are genuine benefits on a safety basis, but there clearly are from an operator's perspective on an economic basis. So that's one area I'm watching very keenly. And then there's the really tough one for organisations, which is driverless vehicles. Again, opinion very divided on this as to what extent a physical person could be removed from the vehicle itself. And whatever your opinion or mine of autonomous vehicles, there's little more certain that the technology is here. It's not going to go away. But in the meantime, while there's still a need for a person behind or beside the wheel, driving behaviour, which is the last part for me, is our and will remain our key focus. So attention to the road, appropriate rest. Effectively, what we train for our drivers is effectively to go out on their journey with the intention of not having a collision, and that remains a big focus for us. And one of the things that I've been thinking about while listening to the presenters is it's a bit of a challenge for me as an operator and somebody who buys systems and vehicles, is to make sure that the different technology is complementary to the systems that we already have in place and doesn't conflict. So I already have a very comprehensive telematic system that is integral to our customer management system, which uses satellite navigation and road maps. So for the adoption of things like ISA, we just need to make sure that there's no conflict between those two systems, that they do complement each other. That's all from me today. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Sean. Again, really interesting to get kind of the industry operators' perspective there. So thank you for sharing your experiences at Asda with us. Just on the final points you were making there around connected and autonomous vehicles, a plug really for one of our upcoming webinars, which I will mention at the end of briefly at the end of the presentations today. We have got a connected and autonomous vehicles webinar taking place in 2 or 3 months' time. So please do have a look out for that one. That should be a really interesting webinar for us, and lots of interesting stuff to talk about there. Our final presentation of the day, I'm delighted to welcome David Lawrence at Telogis. He has pre-recorded his presentation today, but again, he does join us live should you have any questions to put to him following his presentation. So please keep those questions coming in, and we'll start his presentation now. Thank you.
It's great to be included in this break webinar today, and I hope over the next few slides to give you some food for thought and insight into how technology can help you to improve the safety of your drivers. Over the next few minutes, I want to share with you some ideas of the risks in running a fleet to help you put in context why driver safety is so important. I'll also show you how telematics can help drive improvements in safety and change your perception that it's more than just dots on a map. Then I'll give you some insight into how telematics helps transform driver behaviour, and last but not least, what gamification does to help drive adoption and acceptance of telematics out in the field. Let's put the risks of running a fleet into context and start with a few general statistics. The odds of winning the lottery are around 45 million to 1, or you're 3 times less likely than getting struck by lightning, only 40 million to 1. So high odds indeed. Yet many of us happily shell out a couple of pounds every week because we firmly hope that we will have a chance. Strange then at the odds of only 200 to 1, so many people ignore the much more likely outcome of being killed in a car crash and hope that it won't happen to them. It's sobering to know the odds are you are more likely to die in the car journey to buy a lottery ticket than you are to win the lottery itself. It has to be then a very special kind of fleet manager that can stick their head in the sand and ignore the plain truth that is staring them in the face. For the majority of us, driving is the most dangerous part of our job, and the more drivers your fleet has, the more your risks as a company can increase. Speed, like it or not, is a major contributing factor in about half, or 49% to be exact, of all fatal injuries, where the vehicle has been travelling at over 55 miles an hour. To you and me, that's driving on normal B roads, dual carriageways and motorways, or to put it in context, more than 60% of all road miles travelled in the UK. Add to that the fact that 3/4 of all road fatalities are males, and then compare that to your list of drivers, and you're very likely to see a big overlap between higher risk and your average driver and the roads they travel every day. So if nothing else after this webinar, at least take a step back for a moment and ensure your company has plans and policies in place to create an environment for your drivers to better understand their own responsibilities, giving them a chance to train their behaviour behind the wheel. Maybe you're sitting there now thinking of some excuses as to how and why this doesn't concern you, or where else you can shift the blame. I hope not, but just in case, here's a couple of standard responses we hear time and again, and some sobering consequences that might give you reason to stop and think a while. What about the stock objection to reviewing fleet safety? They're all adults, it's not my job to keep an eye on them. Well, I'm afraid that's wrong. Responsibility for a fleet comes with the responsibility to be mindful of the safety and security of your workplace, and company vehicles are considered to be part of the workplace. It's no different than seeing a trip hazard in the office and ignoring it. You have a responsibility to report it and remove the risk. Employees are expected to provide specific instruction on how to behave whilst in charge of a company vehicle and be attentive to poor driving habits in employees like speeding. Scheduling too many jobs in a day, late hours, overrunning work, all can be an excuse for your driver to speed. This is why, even though you are not behind the wheel, you are linked to your driver's behaviour behind the wheel when working for you. However small your involvement, whether you're a fleet manager or a company owner director, this responsibility cannot be avoided. Here's another common objection. I trust my guys. No one looks to take on an employee who they think will take them for a ride or expose their organisation to unnecessary risk. Knowing who is more likely to bend the rules just isn't that easy. Despite the majority of sensible drivers you have out on the road, the more you have, the more likely that one or more of them will at times display a can't be told, won't be told attitude, but they won't do it at interview. The trouble is, if you can't monitor them, then you have no idea which ones are going to be potential offenders. Forget for a moment the literal cost of the business of a driver that speeds around wasting fuel and company money with a heavy right foot. Take a moment and concentrate on his or her increased chances of being in an accident. Remember those stats from the previous slides? And then look at the potential cost to the company, both fiscal and to the company's reputation. Here then lies one of the biggest advantages of telematics, the ability to be able to monitor your assets. That can be both vehicles and people. Most people think that telematics is just dots on a map. And if you want to make sure that you can find the closest member of staff to a new job, then telematics will be very helpful to get you the information you need. However, the majority of telematics systems will also include the right hardware to be able to monitor driving style. And this is where you can benefit most from the wealth of information that comes through. As we mentioned before, most of your drivers will behave responsibly and adhere to company policies on acceptable driving habits. You should all have a policy, right? At Verizon, we encourage our clients to align their policies with their overall company goals. There's no point saying you want to reduce speeding and then have a company goal that reduces the time between visits, unless, of course, you also include scheduling and routing applications to optimize your workload. Most of us have heard about big data. It's a fact there's a very large volume of information available, and it scares some people away from looking at telematics. What is key to a meaningful and productive result, however, is knowing what is useful and what information to act on to stay in control. At Verizon, we teach our clients to manage by exception. That's just to say we encourage them to take more practical overview from all the information at hand and run reports daily, weekly, or even monthly, and construct them based on exceptions to a rule and ensure they are aligned to your company goals. Using reports at management level frees you from being bogged down in the detail of the everyday. You can help make your drivers safer by monitoring and giving them the feedback on driving habits, such as harsh acceleration and braking, giving them guidance to make adjustments on their own without the expense of blanket driver training programs. Measuring on speeding is probably the most visible sign that a driver is taking risks, and therefore should be high on any fleet manager's list of bad habits to keep in check. It's important to note that you have the flexibility to decide what parameters are acceptable. So if your company has a zero tolerance policy to speeding, you can set alerts to kick in at just 1 mile an hour over the posted speed limit. Just be aware that you will likely get a lot of infractions coming through and have to manage that data. Most of our clients will, however, set a buffer of maybe 5 to 10 miles an hour above the posted limits or a 10% tolerance, which gives them much more flexibility when being able to look at what infractions really mean to the business. Having a more realistic buffer will also stop the accusation of being Big Brother, one of the most used excuses for not employing telematics. On the Big Brother point, remember it's only data. What you do with it is what counts. Now, personally, I quite like my Big Brother as he tends to look out for me. But it is worth trying to avoid a more Orwellian approach to monitoring so you can keep your drivers on side. It's also now so much easier to utilize telematics to roll in safety checks on vehicles. Make sure that your drivers are in roadworthy vehicles by getting them to complete regular vehicle inspection reports using free-to-download driver apps on company-supplied smartphones. So, how does telematics actually make a difference? We know that a vehicle is an extension of the workplace, so it's a case of keeping that sense of professionalism front of mind when no one else is looking over your shoulder. Easier in the office than out on the road. To use a close analogy, if you're in an open office with colleagues walking past all day, you're not likely to indulge in naughty habits like checking Facebook or doing your online shopping. Being seen or being monitored focuses the individual acting in a professional manner in line with the company expectations. Likewise, in-vehicle monitoring causes drivers to pause and think. Knowing that their actions are visible encourages them to behave professionally in line with company expectations. It's a brave individual that wants to stick their head above the parapet to stand out from the crowd for the wrong reason. It's much easier to conform to the norm. We mentioned a few minutes ago that telematics now includes the ability to communicate with your drivers via their smartphones. What is key here is that smartphones are fairly ubiquitous and a piece of hardware that your drivers are used to interacting with every day. Having access to a platform in your driver's hands allows you to ensure that you can communicate with them regularly. With this in mind, any monitored telematics program needs to become embedded in your driver's daily routine, or it runs a very real risk of becoming just another company fad. I'm sure we've all seen the latest initiative from an employer that goes out for a couple of months and then fizzles away to nothing. Well-intentioned improvement programs by management or HR help to pull companies together, but often get replaced by the next big idea. Now, that's not to say that all initiatives don't work, but it's a real challenge to ensure longevity for any improvement program. We all know driving and safety is not a fad, and therefore finding a way of keeping drivers interested and engaged is no small feat at all. This is where gamification comes in. It applies the principles of gameplay, i.e. scoring points and competing with others, and allows you to keep a regular check on drivers in a format that they can easily interact with, whilst making use of their natural curiosity and competitive nature. Opting your drivers into a coaching app means for the first time they can get visibility into their own driving habits. Once they know which areas they need to improve, they can then work on them and see their progress on a regular basis. Also, benchmarking themselves against their peers introduces a friendly, competitive environment with everyone trying to be the best, or conversely highlighting those drivers who need a little more attention. Where these programs work best is when the company recognizes and rewards their staff for individual and team improvements. It's a quick win for a company that wants to make real measurable improvements and encourage a minimum standard of driving. This doesn't have to cost much money, if any at all, although some companies do use the fuel savings to reward performance as well. Contrary to the often aforementioned company initiatives, use of coaching apps becomes part of the fabric of the company and helps to serve as a constant reminder to drivers to ensure they are always at the top of their game. So, in summary, unless you already have telematics or a crystal ball, you probably don't have enough insight into your drivers and how they behave behind the wheel to meet your responsibilities. Remember the statistics, and as a minimum, look deep into your organisation and make sure that you have the right policies in place and that they are aligned with your business goals. Whether you're looking to make efficiency increases or safety improvements, technology can help you. Telematics is no longer an Orwellian piece of science fiction. It's a reality, and if used properly, it can keep you, your drivers, and your company safe. Now, I've barely scratched the surface of what telematics can do for your business, but if you do want to know more about telematics and how it can improve your company's safety or any of the other money-saving benefits, then I'll be endeavoured to answer your questions at the end of this webinar, or just leave your details and I'll come back to you personally. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for your presentation. Another, again, really interesting and a really good roundup to today's presentations. So that brings us to today's Q&A session. We've had a number of questions, as I said, come in throughout our 5 presentations, and we're just in the process of unmuting our panelists, our speakers, and I will put forward those questions now to our speakers. And please continue to put any additional questions and submit any additional questions as well, and we'll do our best to get through to those. So the first question I've got is one for Jane, specifically about your presentation. Jane, you mentioned that a benefit of ISA for Transport for London was marginal safety improvements modelled. Did you see any reductions in road casualties as part of that? I think we may have lost you, Jane. I don't know whether you've muted yourself, possibly.
Sorry, was that?
I can hear you now, Jane.
No, I only heard half your question, I'm afraid. Could you repeat it?
I absolutely can do, sorry. So you mentioned that a benefit of ISA for TfL was a marginal safety improvement modelled. Did you see any reductions in road casualties as part of that?
That's an interesting question. Because the trial was only on 2 routes for a relatively short period of time, and actually a lot of the collisions that involve buses in London actually aren't speed related because our buses don't travel particularly fast, particularly in the central area. That wasn't really anything that we could get any accurate data on, but modelling suggests that over time we would see in cost benefit analysis terms maybe a reduction of about £500,000 in terms of savings.
Okay, thank you, Jane. A couple of questions that came through throughout David's, but also Richard, your presentation as well. One question is, are all of the systems, David, that you discussed widely available for commercial vehicles and vans, and what influence is being put on leasing companies?
Well, they certainly are available in commercial vehicles as well, yeah. And the new, as I understand it, the new European Union regulations will be across all vehicle classes. I think Richard knows probably more than I do about that.
Yeah, absolutely right, David. So we need to be careful how we classify our vehicles, but the sort of smaller vans, the 3.5 tonners or the car-derived vehicles, certainly some of those on the market now have intelligent speed assistance or something similar and speed limiters, and some have autonomous emergency braking. For the larger trucks, the autonomous emergency braking for vehicle-to-vehicle collisions is mandated and has been for a few years, so that's fitted already. So we expect to see the sorts of technologies that we talk about for passenger cars on larger vehicles too, and if the Parliament and Council approve it, as David described, over the next months, perhaps year of legislative process, then that would apply to all vehicles from 2021-22.
Thank you, Richard. Okay, another question we've had, which I think is kind of following on from that a little bit, is LCVs often get lost in between car and truck safety systems. Is anything being specifically developed to improve safety for vans? And then the question goes on to say, as we all know, van drivers are often the most distracted and under the most pressure to achieve schedules for delivery.
Do you want me to have a go at that one as well?
Yeah, if you could do, please. Thank you.
So, yeah, it's historically the way vehicle safety regulations have worked has been about passive safety, have been about crash tests, and they've really applied to passenger cars first. As the standards have extended, so David was talking about ESC, electronic stability control, and now we're heading towards a world when we're thinking about autonomous emergency braking being regulated and ISA and so on. Those systems are being considered for the I'm going to name vehicles. So if you think of transit of all sizes, so car-derived vans through to medium-sized vans. The proposal, and it's only a proposal going through the European Parliament, is that those vehicles would be expected to be mandated fitted with these sorts of technologies. Some on the market already have these technologies. So as a consumer, you could choose to favour that vehicle. If you were a fleet buyer, you might want to specify that it must have speed limiter, for example, as a standard fit.
Thank you, Richard.
So I could just make one, just sort of an anecdote for myself. Is years ago, I had a job delivering newspapers in central London. I was in a little van, and I remember we had to try and get them around central London news. It was an international newspapers, a sort of a mix of some Arabic papers and various others. A particular little company. I was doing a kind of student job, and the whole idea was to get them into these main sales places before anybody kind of wandered down to the shops about 7 a.m. and it was terrible, the pressure around it, to go hurtling around London delivering all these. So I know exactly what you're talking about.
Thank you, David. Quite a specific question here, Sean, for you actually. What DVR camera system do you use within your ASDA fleet on your vans, and what sort of capacity does that hard drive have in terms of number of days or potentially number of weeks?
Okay, yeah, great question. So we have a consolidated system through a company called the Vehicle Group. The hard drive we're currently using is a 2 terabyte hard drive. Now, clearly, it only has so much capacity, so it depends on the usage of the vehicle. So our home delivery vehicles, because they're very heavily used, I think someone just mentioned how difficult it is for van drivers and how pressured it is. They tend to be working from 6 till 10 pretty much constantly. That's 6 in the morning till 10 in the evening. We'll probably get anything between 20 to 28 days recorded. On the heavy fleet, we've typically enjoyed a little bit longer than that because they tend to have a little bit more downtime throughout the day. So perhaps 35 days is how far we'd be able to go back with footage requests. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Thanks, Sean. Just one final question then that is that's come through, which is asking what do we do, and what would the speakers recommend we do with underperforming drivers? So I guess in relation to all of the technology that we've talked around, and if that is identifying drivers who are not perhaps doing what we would like them to do, or showing behaviours that we are keen for them not to be showing. What can we do? So perhaps one, I think maybe for Sean, maybe for Jane initially, from an operator's perspective.
Would you like me to go first, Jane?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay, super. Fundamentally, I'd use one word, and that's coaching. So many drivers do not know how well they drive until you're able to show them how they drive and then coach them into driving differently. So, we debrief drivers on a regular basis using whatever information is available for us to do so. Some of the most powerful information is video footage of driving. Now, we haven't got to a situation yet where we're using driver-facing cameras, but certainly drivers can see, and we can show them the view from the cab that they enjoy when they're driving, and we can see the types of driving behaviour that I think we would want them to adjust. So coaching would be my words.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with Sean. I think traditionally, certainly in the bus industry, sort of discipline has been the first port of call with drivers and poor driving behaviour. And actually, you know, we want to take a bit of a leaf out of the rail industry's book if we want to improve our safety record and improve our safety maturity, and actually look more at, you know, how we can retrain and provide drivers with the right support so that they can drive in the best way possible.
Thank you. Thank you both for that. One final quick question that's just come through. This one's specifically directed at you, Sean. So this is all available as the liveried fleet. What cab do you use for your grey fleet, and what driver training do your grey fleet drivers get, and can you encourage use of technology by them?
It's a very good question. I feel very popular as well today. I think the short answer is I can't talk on behalf of the grey fleet. I don't have responsibility in that area. I can talk a little bit to some of our principles, which is we focus on a risk base. So our greatest risks remain the commercial vehicles in terms of potential impact, both from an injury and incident perspective as well as from a financial. But notwithstanding, we're on a journey, and that journey includes grey fleet as well as company car drivers themselves. On a company car basis, we certainly encourage some of the safest vehicles by only populating that list with safe vehicles. And it was only quite recently I was talking to the colleagues responsible for company cars and policy around grey fleet, around, you know, how do we evolve our safety credentials in that area. It probably sounds like a little bit of a woolly answer, but as I say, you know, everything we're doing is part of a journey over time.
Okay, thank you very much, Sean. Thank you for that. Okay, that's our questions all answered. If you do think of any further questions, then please feel free to drop us an email following today's webinar, and we're more than happy to put any additional questions through to the speakers and to respond directly to you on those. Just finally, then, my final slide. I'd just like to say a big thank you to all of our speakers today. Copies of their presentations, as I mentioned earlier, and a recording of today's webinar will be made available online shortly. We'll be sending you all an online feedback form as well following today's event, and we would really appreciate it if you could take a few minutes to complete that for us. Your feedback is really important to us. Any suggestions you've got for future webinars and events, please put those forward to us as well, as that's all really useful information for us. Just up on screen now, you can see our some of our upcoming events. We've got a full program of events taking place throughout 2018. On screen now, you can see a selection of our next scheduled webinars. We're also taking bookings for our annual Fleet Safety Conference within the UK, which is taking place in Birmingham on the 25th of May, and our 2018 Fleet Safety Awards, both our UK awards and our Australasian awards, are now very much open for entries. So please have a look at those too. For any more information, please take a look at the Brake Professional website, or email professional@brake.org.uk, and we will come back to you and try and help with any queries that you might have. And just finally, before we finish, just one more thank you, a big thank you again to Telogis, who have sponsored today's event. Thank you for your continued support, and thank you once again to all of today's speakers. we'll leave it there. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you for logging on today.
Yes.